Hello and welcome to the House of Strength podcast. I am your host, Ryan Muncie, and this is episode number 17. And today is going to be the first of several Eat Local podcasts that we're going to do. I've been fortunate enough to get in contact with Maureen Best, who is the executive director of LEAP. So, Maureen, why don't you tell us what LEAP stands for and why it's so cool that we've run into you?
Hi, I'm Maureen, and I'm the Executive Director of LEAP, and LEAP is a nonprofit based out of Roanoke, Virginia. It stands for Local Environmental Agricultural Project, and what we're trying to do is to essentially rebuild the local food system in the valley, so support local producers and also provide market outlets for local consumers.
Awesome. So that's an initiative that's near and dear to the hearts of anybody who's into the whole grassroots food movements and paleo and eating grass-fed meats and things like that. So Maureen and LEAP have some really cool projects going on. We're going to get into that soon. But one of the other things is that, as she mentioned, they have some connections to a lot of local farmers. So on each one of these episodes, Maureen is going to be introducing us and putting us in touch with one such farmer. And if you're watching on video, you've already seen Josh. So I want to welcome in Josh Deel, who owns, along with his wife, Lena, the Barefoot Farms. If you guys want to look them up, we'll just plug it right now. It's thebarefootfarm.com. Josh, thanks a lot for hanging out with us today and welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me this morning.
All right. So, Josh, let's get right into it. What makes you guys different?
Yeah, well, I guess to answer that in a short way, we are, first of all, a family farm, which is quite novel nowadays. There aren't a whole lot of us around. You have a lot of factory farming, and you have some hobby farms just because the way that agriculture is in this country, it doesn't really favor the small family farm. It's either go big or get out. I mean, that's been the mantra in agriculture for decades now.
So I want to kind of pause, and I think you and I and Maureen know exactly what some of that stuff means. But for people listening, and I guess that's exactly who we want to really educate with this, is the person who may not know exactly what we mean when we say factory farm, and when you say that the way that the agricultural system is set up, it doesn't favor that small farm. Why not? What's going on? Kind of tell that whole story for us.
Yeah, sure. Well, through public policy and farm bills and just a host of, I think a cumulative effect over the last several decades in food, there's been a favoring of larger and larger, say, corporate farms. They're not really farms in the pastoral sense that most people would think of when they go to the grocery store and they see the scenic little labels with some nice little picture of the family farm. They're really these cold, sterile, confined operations that are controlled by multi-billion-dollar interests. And the way that lobbying and other policies are set in this country, it favors more and more of those larger corporate operations, making barriers to entrance into agriculture very high. And it doesn't really, it pushes more and more folks out of rural America. I mean, we see that every day, the emptying of the countryside. Just go for a drive and you'll see abandoned farmhouse after abandoned farmhouse. You might see a few guys, some older guys out there who still have cows as a hobby or a tax write-off, but it's not the functioning family farm that we have this kind of romantic idea of. It just doesn't exist like it once did. And so there are some of us who are re-pioneering that. We're going back into landscapes. We're going back onto the yesteryear's farmland and trying to make a go at it. So that's what we're doing. We're real farmers. That's what we tell people. And even at the farmers market, sometimes they're shocked to find out, wow, you guys do this full time. So what's your real job? I get asked that a lot. So it is a novel thing. Like I said, that kind of makes us different right off the bat, that we're we're doing this full time.
Well, that's really cool. And so, I mean, I guess you kind of explain, I guess you painted a picture of what a factory farm is and looks like. Tell the listeners why that's not ideal living conditions for the animals and how it affects our food supply.
Yeah, well, you know, when we made the transition into farming, I'll paint a picture in human terms, and then we'll understand this really well with animals. Before this, I used to work in a corporate setting, Dilbert cubicle style. Okay, as far as you could see, I mean, just cubicle on top of cubicle, hundreds and hundreds of cubicles packed in a small space, and I was shoulder to shoulder with my coworkers, and just the added stress and just frustration and so forth that comes from that environment. It's not natural. Even the habits that formed there. You might have one person who starts reaching for, say soda and Twinkies or whatever, and before you know, it's just like everybody's doing this. It's just like we're all feeding at the trough of just such degradation. And it's the same thing with animals that are put in confined spaces. It's not natural. It's sterile. And creates a lot of health issues, and these have been well documented with, say, like Food Inc., for example. That was a great documentary that came out a few years ago. I know Weston A. Price Foundation and others have lots of information really highlighting nutritionally what goes wrong in those environments. So I don't really have to say outline or try to pick that industry apart. It's pretty well documented now, just how the stress hormones that are released in the animals in those environments just really impacts negatively the nutrition and the taste of those meats. Plus, environmentally, the cost is huge. I mean, with the manure lagoons that are created by these huge factory setups that just have an outrageous both environmental cost. And if you ever wanted to come in there after this operation is done and clean that up, you're talking an astronomical price to clean it up. It's very toxic. So it's just a really unfortunate situation that we're in with the food supply. With food having thousands of miles attached to it. I mean, we might be getting bacon that was produced 2,000 miles away and hauled in here. But again, it's just through people's choices and looking the other way that the food system's kind of grown into this, I don't know, just this maze of just confined animal feed operations, and it's just really tragic. I don't know. The more I think about it, and when I'm out on pasture and I see how happy our animals are, I'm thinking, man, all animals should have this kind of lifestyle. All farmers should be able to feel good about themselves in the way that we do when we're raising these animals. But yeah, so I'm not sure if I came back to the question, but it's a huge environmental cost, and just stress on the animals.
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a good job of answering that. And for people listening, we're going to have in the show notes on the blog links to some of the resources that both Maureen and Josh mentioned. So like Weston A. Price and Food Inc. and anything else that we go over today, we'll have links for people to pursue those easily if they want more information. But you mentioned the environmental cost and the effects if anybody ever wanted to inhabit that land or do anything with that land after the farm left. Talk a little bit about how that factory farm affects the ecosystem and our soil. And I know you guys are big on the permaculture, whereas most of these factory farms are what we would consider a monoculture. Talk a little bit about that. And I know that's something that's important with you at Barefoot Farms.
Yeah, well, it's pretty simple. It's like taking, say, a big box store. I won't throw any names out there in particular, but just imagine taking up dozens and dozens of acres to pour concrete and to destroy whatever ecosystem was in place to put in this, again, cold, sterile, concrete, farming in man's image instead of nature's image, set up to run animals in there. It's just ridiculous. I mean, the environmental cost, it obliterates ecosystems locally. Typically, it will pollute water sheds in the area. and just create a huge list of environmental consequences for that local community. Not to mention the pollution, the odors, the pathogen buildup. It's not very pleasant. I mean, anytime you take a drive, say on 81, Interstate 81, going towards DC or anything, you start going by those poultry houses, or anytime you get behind, let's say, like a tractor trailer truck that has it's been stacked with swine from top to bottom, front to back. I mean, it's the same way in those CAFO houses. I mean, those are toxins building up. That's pollution. It's really damaging to the ecosystem. So again, you can just imagine putting a huge box store, or in this case, multi-million square foot facility on what would otherwise be productive ecosystem or land, and just totally wiping that in this massive system. Not to mention they take a ton of water from the local area to operate. So again, you have a drain on all these natural resources that would otherwise be put to much more productive use. Especially like in our setup where it is permaculture oriented, as you mentioned, we would maximize those things instead of just wasting valuable, resources.
So what does that mean? What will you define for the people listening permaculture, and how you guys use that or make that so?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to keep that really simple, permaculture is a design system. It's a holistic way of approaching, say, land management. It can be applied on small urban scale, like your back porch, or say you have 1/10 of an acre. But it's a holistic way of looking at all the systems of a site. So, for example, on our farm, which is around 112 acres, it's how we look at water management mixed with, say, using solar and wind energy, as well as the placement of all the elements on the farm so that there's a closed loop, if you will, that the system itself is holistic, it's sustainable, that the end or byproduct of one element would be perhaps the starting element of another system. So, for example, if you had gray water coming out of a faucet or something after you clean vegetables, instead of that being wasted into a septic system or something like that, we want to recycle that gray water and send it back out possibly into some raised garden beds so that there's no waste. That's just a real simple example. But we're looking at the entire site that way, from how we manage the animals, their movements, how we build better forages or ecosystems with the interactions of trees and grazing animals, to the placement of all our structures and trying to do those in a responsible way so that we don't have to use more than we really need, while also being productive. So it's a really integrated approach. There's a lot of observation. There's not a whole lot of us trying to impose our will upon the landscape, but it's more of listening to that landscape, observing, and letting it teach us so that we can model our farm again in nature's image, so that we're doing it very sustainably, very holistically.
I'm glad you said kind of in nature's image. My experience or the way I kind of learned about that permaculture was through Joel Salatin at Polyface Farms. And, the way he explained it was, if you look at nature, things don't exist in isolation in nature. Anywhere you look, there are a lot of species interacting and cohabitating. So, they talk about the way they rotate their animals on the farm, where the cattle may be the first through a certain patch of land, and they eat the grass, and then when they put their solid waste on the ground, you're left with things for the chickens the next day to forage through and pick through and distribute. And then when the chickens go somewhere else, then they bring the pigs in, and the pigs root and uproot everything, and it perpetuates this cycle where you're using the land, but then you're also nourishing it and allowing it to recover and regenerate. Whereas with that monoculture, all you do is just destroy, deplete, and the only way to make it habitable for anything else in the future, or for the next year's, or the next time you put the cattle on that land, is you've got to use a ton of chemicals and pesticides and things that are unhealthy for both the land, the larger environment, and the animals. So
right, yeah, and therein is another point about how unsustainable that system truly is, because you're bringing in all these external inputs to the system, and you can only get away with that for so long. Eventually, the fertility will cease. You will burn out all the natural life that's there, and you'll be left with something that's highly underproductive, and it's just not going to be able to sustain the kind of animal life that it once could. So yeah, the mob stock rotational grazing leader follower system that Salatin has pioneered, I mean, it's huge. We've gleaned a lot from that. There are other models as well. Mark Sheppard out of Wisconsin is another guy that we've closely watched and visited his farm, because he integrates a lot of trees, productive trees, and that was one of the first things we did with our farm when we purchased it last year, was to plant several thousand trees. These are for the purpose of producing nuts and fruits and berries and such like that, because when you are running animals, not just on pasture, but silvopasture, the integration of trees as well, those animals are getting a full spectrum of nutrition. It's like eating a salad. Instead of just having iceberg lettuce, you're getting a variety of greens and colors and flavors and nutrition, so that in the end, that meat that you enjoy so well, or those eggs, have a higher nutrient density and quality that you can't get simply on pasture or feeding grains or what have you. I mean, that's another reason, like, for example, with chickens, meat birds or laying hens, even the old free-range models, quote, free range, they utilize stationary buildings, and they would sometimes rotate the animals in a wheel and spoke design around it. I mean, the building never moved, and the animals would just kind of rotate around it. But what happens, you still have a heavy saturation of nitrogen in that soil, so that over time the forage becomes so bitter. It's very very difficult for those animals to enjoy eating that. So they're going to depend more on grain, and the nutrition quality of the eggs and the meat is going to drop. So again, that's why the ecological and nutritional advantages of, say, our model over the commercial or even organic models of, quote, free range is far superior, because these birds they're on portable yards, if you will, or portable buildings that go to fresh pasture, fresh forage, just about every day or every other day. It's just far superior, and it builds the local ecosystem. We just took some pictures. I need to get these posted online, of where we had taken our first batch of meat broilers through a pasture, and you can see the spot where they really hit and concentrated the manure and just their scratching and just all their natural, the chickenness of the chicken. And you can compare a lot just adjacent to that where we didn't run the chickens. And it's amazing just how lush and robust the forage is that's coming back in that one spot. And so you can imagine, if you're doing what you said earlier with like Salatin's model over the entire landscape, just how repaired and restored you can make that local ecosystem. But again, we're rotating them. They're not abusing that spot. They hit it and they move on. Again, much like in nature, we see that, the rotational grazing patterns of animals, typically because they have predator pressure moving them on. But in this system, we kind of mimic that by rotationally moving them every day. So it's more time, a lot more management, but in the end, it's well worth it. I mean, it's a superior nutritional product and flavor, and hey, we feel pretty good about it too, about raising animals that way.
Yeah, as you should. So I want Maureen to kind of jump in here. I mean, you've been biting your tongue. I know there have been a few times where you wanted to jump and say something. So, I think my question would be, to follow up with some of that for Josh, but since Maureen is here, you're the perfect person to answer this question. Is, we need more farmers to kind of take the leap and do what you've done. So, first of all, thank you. But second of all, we need more people more public people to, like Josh said earlier, it's a vote. You're making the choice. and every dollar that you spend on food is a vote one way or the other. So, Maureen, how can we try to make this, transition? How can we help it gain steam and kind of, build?
I think that's the $1,000,000 question. So much of what we do and how we make decisions tend to be based out of convenience, especially when it comes to food. In the United States, we have some of the lowest food costs in the world. Some countries pay 50% or more of their monthly expenses on food. In the United States, it's a lot closer to 25% or less. So we expect cheap food. We are overwhelmed, upset when food is expensive. We expect really cheap food, and the way that we're able to produce cheap food is through using a lot of large-scale, high-input, high-yield production models in the United States, and that model has also been exported all around the world. So we have shifted how the production side of it is in the United States, and then also we import a lot of food that's produced the same way from other parts of the world with really low gas costs. It's shifted how we value or how we're able to really put a price tag on food. And so, what Josh alluded to the past, couple decades, I'd say, probably from the 1940s really is when things started to change and really picked up speed. The 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, just continuing to go a lot more towards corporate production and cheap food. And so now it's really going back and saying, what is the true cost of food? What are we putting in our body? How does that affect us? How does that affect the world around us? How does that affect our local economy, our global economy? If you can look at it at a very local micro scale, or you can look at it globally, and this huge impact the United States agriculture system has had on the world. And really, it does come down to individual decisions, understanding, making a decision, saying, hey, maybe I can't get 100% of my food from small scale producers, but I'm going to try for $10 a week or $20 a week. 10%. 10% is a pretty common number where people start out trying to do a 10% shift. And if everyone was doing 10% shift, then there would be a lot more demand for local food, and hopefully that would also be able to be mirrored by increased production. Because what Josh talked about, it's really, really expensive to get into food production. Really high startup costs for farmers. So there's a lot of individual decision. There's a lot of policy decisions. The U.S. government, USDA has some local food programs and farmers market promotions. They're really getting big, but there's also a lot of you have one system that has multiple hands that are doing very contradictory things sometimes. So, the end of the day, what can you as an individual do is ask questions, do research, and try and find out where your food's coming from. Ask those questions. If the easiest place for you to shop is at a Kroger, then ask the produce people, where is this food coming from? And then maybe when you understand a little bit more where the food's coming from, then you can start to make those decisions about how you feel about where that food's coming from.
Well, you said something in there, the 10% or $10 or whatever. And one of the things that we talk about at House of Strength is focusing on progress, not perfection. So whether your goal is to be the world's strongest man or to lose 100 pounds, whatever it is, you've got to get one foot moving in front of the other. So that's why we love that saying, is focus on progress, not perfection. And I've never heard that approach to eating the way that we're talking about eating. So that's really, really cool. And I think if people listening could adopt that in some form, whatever fits your lifestyle or your goals, that's really cool. Where can people, let's say somebody says, okay, well, all right, I'm in, I want to do my 10% or my 20%. What's the easiest way for people to find, foods from a farm like Josh, or somebody else like that?
So one thing that is really cool is that in Virginia and nationwide, the growth of farmers markets has been huge. So farmers markets are when producers like like Barefoot Farms, they'll come and they'll sell their product directly to customers. So instead of having a grocery store act as an intermediary or a distributor act as an intermediary, it's customer to producer, which is also called direct marketing. So that's how it used to be, and so a lot of what we're trying to do is trying to go back to that model, because the producer gets more money for it. They're not they're getting retail prices as opposed to wholesale prices, so it's great for the producer, and then the customer can have a real interaction, a real exchange, and ask those questions. Where is this grown? How is this grown? Because not all producers have the same decision models, production models, and so it's, you know, it allows the consumer to have a little bit more say in it, and it supports the producer. So in Roanoke, for example, there are tons of farmers markets. Not all of them are the same, so I always encourage people to check them out. LEAP runs Grandin Village Community Market, which is open every Saturday through late April through the end of October from 8 to noon. And then the West End Community Market is a year-round market in Roanoke, and that's on Patterson Street in the West End neighborhood. So it's inside in the winter, and you know, the winter season sometimes is a little bit slower because you can't have, say, fresh tomatoes year round because of seasonality. So a lot of it's also saying, okay, I'm going to try and eat more with the seasons. If you don't eat more with the seasons, then it makes it really hard to buy local produce. Meat is the exception, even though there are production seasons. Meat you are able to freeze, and that's what a lot of producers do, is that they'll freeze it and they'll be able to sell it throughout the winter. And then downtown Roanoke has a market. There's a market in Greenbrier in South County, and most states have a website where it'll list them all. So Virginia says Virginia grown. And then you can even just Google farmers market and then your town, and there's buy fresh, buy local campaigns in a lot of cities. And you know, there is information on the web about farmers markets. Connecting directly with farmers is sometimes more challenging because not all farmers have direct options. And another really, for some people it's easier, is to do the CSA, community supported agriculture. So you're working with one farmer and you're buying a subscription. Is some people like to think of our food box program, but what you're doing is you're paying for all the money the beginning of the season. It gives startup costs to producer, and then throughout the season you're taking a share of what is produced on that land. So that's a really common model. It's good for consumers and it's good for producers. So then you would pick it up weekly. Sometimes they're dropped off. It really depends on the farm. And in the Roanoke area, Good Food, Good People, they have a CSA, and they also have an online shopping menu, essentially, so you can click which you can pre-order things and then pick them up at a farmer's market. And a lot of other farmers are able to do the same thing. So that way, if you only can come to the market at the very end, everything isn't completely gone.
Well, you said two things in there that I know we've talked about before on the podcast that I definitely want to reiterate. Is, you know, one, like you said in the very beginning, you know, a lot of people want cheap food, and when you first start talking about eating this way or eating healthy, the first thought that pops into everybody's mind is that it's too expensive or it costs more, and that doesn't have to be the case. If you're intelligent and you put some thought and some planning into how you acquire your food, you know, like you said, if you do the CSA, the community supported agriculture, you can get all your produce, or you could go to a farmer and get half a cow or a quarter of a cow and freeze the meat, and you're going to end up paying less per pound that way than if you went to a traditional grocery store. So you're going to pay less, and you're going to get higher quality food, so you'll be healthier. And then the word that you mentioned, or the phrase that you mentioned earlier, is the true cost of food. And if you're paying less for a higher quality food, then you're healthier, which is going to offset medical bills. You know, you're not going to have to pay for, you know, prescriptions, or you're not going to have to deal with being overweight or sick or any of that stuff down the road. So if people can just kind of put that convenience thing on the shelf and look at, you know, what you're actually doing, and just put thought in, you know, so I'm not going to get on that soapbox right now. So, and then the other thing was, I don't know, it slipped my mind now, but I'm sure it'll come back. But you know, so I guess the next question is for both of you guys. Josh from the farming standpoint, and then Maureen from the consumer standpoint. Um, is this method of farming? I mean, it's yes, we see that it is sustainable after the conversation of monoculture and versus the permaculture. But can we actually feed the world this way? If we got away from that factory farming method, is it possible? Are we able to produce enough food to feed the world?
Yeah, well, not that I referenced the UN or many of their reports that come out, but they even issued a report recently within the last few months that showed the way of small, local, sustainable type family farms is the way of the future to feed the world. And that was, a massive report that they did. Whether you put stock in what they say or not, and that's something entirely different. But a lot of Europe still goes the way of the small family farm, and they do just fine. And we see case after case where large genetically modified operations and interests have gone into by our standards, underdeveloped nations, and have really wreaked havoc on the local agricultural communities. If we were to lose that influence worldwide and instead go to a more holistically based agriculture, wherein, let's say, urban areas, you have something like urban permaculture or urban agriculture, where people are doing most of their foods right where they are, in community gardens or so forth, with a combination of farms like ourselves that can produce, broader acreage items like the beef or the pork or the chicken and things like that folks want. Absolutely, we can change the food system and certainly feed the world. I mean, there are already enough calories produced as is globally to more than feed everyone. It's just what quality do we want? Cheap, quote cheap, genetically modified foods, or do we want quality, nutritional foods? And that can be done right where folks are. I mean, truly, I may be hurting my own, interest as a farmer by saying, hey, you can grow your own food, but truly you can. I mean, that's the reality here. You can grow a lot of your own food where you are, and what you lack, you could easily supplement, like I said, with farms like ourselves. And just real quick to touch on Maureen, what you were saying earlier about spending $10 or $20 or whatever, making those steps, baby steps towards getting all of your food or most of your food from local sources or just more nutritional sources. That's how we got into this. We started realizing after we had children that, with our first son, he had some sensitivities to a lot of the foods we were buying in the grocery store, even the labeled organic ones. So where we were living, we said, okay, let's go to farmers markets. That was our first step. And then once we got to farmers markets, we started to select for the farms that were open to customer inspection, if you will. Like, how are you doing this? Are you spraying anything on those tomatoes? And really getting to know them. And right down to going to the farms that we were getting our meats from, like our chicken, and saying, hey, can we be a part of your processing day? And it was just those small steps after step after step that not only led us to eating everything locally and seasonally, but now we're on the other side of that farmer's market table, selling those products and raising those animals. And now we're also doing it in an environmentally conscious type of effort, where we're not only trying to produce good food, but also rehabilitate landscape while we're doing it. And so, yes, the answer is a resounding yes. We can feed the world, and we can feed them with highly nutritious food, and we can change local economies to empower people, empower a small, a million villages, if you will, with good food, nutritionally enhanced food, local economies, artisan, craftsmen. We can change the face of the planet. I believe that. We just each have to take that step, realize our interconnectedness with one another, and then take personal responsibility for our role in it.
Yeah, that's really well said, and the personal responsibility part of that is huge. I mean, and you said that earlier when you mentioned that we all are voting every time we make a choice. So um, we're gonna kind of work our way towards wrapping it up. So while you're kind of on that thought process, Josh, we always finish. We want each guest to give one piece of advice for our listeners. So if they only take one thing away from this, what's the most important thing in your mind for listeners to take away from today?
All right. Well, I would say for the listeners today who are, folks interested in good food, hopefully getting it as locally produced as possible. Like what we say, we're a beyond organic farm, almost wild, and and I would say what that really means is we're trying to help inform consumers that their food quality standards should be so much more than just a label, a USDA inspected or a USDA organic label. It should really be, like I mentioned earlier, a customer inspected relationship with that farmer. Have an open relationship. Get to know where your food comes from. Who is your farmer? We have T-shirts we wear at the farmers market that poses that question. Who's your farmer? Get to know the people who are feeding your children. Get to know the people who are putting that food in your own, body. That's important. Find out how it's grown. Go visit those farms, and then support those people who are out there taking that very brave step. I'm not, trying to give myself praise in that, but really, I mean, these are very difficult times to try to figure out where's the path, like we've discussed in this podcast. How do we get to that point of the small family farm? Like navigating that's very difficult, and so support those people as much as you can, and whether that's through CSAs or just frequent, shopping or purchasing from them at farmers markets, or even just a thank you or you can do it type of morale booster. It goes a long ways. So get to know your farmer. Get to know your farmer.
Awesome. That's really great. So Maureen, we'll let you answer that question too. What's the most important thing that you want the listeners to take away from this today?
I guess I'm still a little bit stuck on an earlier conversation that we were talking about in terms of can this model of production really feed the world? And I can't help but just want to say that a lot of times the conversation of whether or not I think that United States, we have this undue pressure that we're supposed to feed the world, and that there's this fear of not being able to feed the world and what's going to happen when everyone continues to grow in population size. And a lot of it, I guess, is fear-based, and I think that we can individually act out of goodwill and community instead of acting out of fear. And sometimes you can really get consumed with that we have to use this huge model of production in order to make it happen because this is what the statistics say, or this is what the population trends say, as opposed to really stepping back, taking a deep breath and saying, okay, as an individual, what can I do? As a community, what can I do? And just because this is how we have been doing it doesn't mean that it's the best way to be doing it, because for generations and generations we were small scale farming, and we were feeding each other, and we were collaborating and sharing and trading and coming together and functioning as a community. And just because we've become more individualistic and more siloed doesn't mean that we can't still recreate that sense of community where we're all coming together to support this world that we live in, and what that truly means, as opposed to what it means on a really individual, idealistic, or not even idealistic, on a really individual level.
That's really really cool. I think you bring up a really great point, and I don't know these numbers. So if you guys know these numbers, throw them out there. And if anybody listening can find this, then post it on the comments or send it to me, and we'll put it in a future podcast. But you make the point that we maybe, or I guess it popped into my head as you're speaking. I mean, are we really feeding the world now? Well, no, our model doesn't feed the world now. And how much food is our country actually contributing to other countries? I know for a fact that a lot of our excess factory farmed produced food goes back into our flawed systems of, a lot of corn is used for, the stuff that we're feeding our animals that, we are trying to get away from with, initiatives like what Josh and their farm is doing. So that would be an interesting statistic if we could find out, what that actual number is. If we're so worried about, out of fear, whether this new model could actually feed the world, that the one that we have now isn't. So that's a great point. So both of you guys, tell everybody where we can find you. So we'll start with you, Josh. Where can people find you? Both the farm on the internet, but also some markets if they want to get some of your produce and meats.
Yeah, well, right now, every Saturday, you can find us at the Grandin Village Community Market. And through the week, we're at the farm in Newcastle, Virginia, trying to finish right now our on-farm store. We've had a bit of a delay with construction, seeing that we are that construction crew, as well as full-time farming. So very soon, though, we hope to have that open. I mean, folks still come by and see the place and pick up product when they're there. But you can also find us online at thebarefootfarm.com, and there are links to our Facebook page as well. Just due to the nature of the season, we try to keep it as updated as possible, but sometimes that's a bit of a logistical challenge. Yeah, we try to keep you updated there.
All right, cool. Do you guys ship? So if somebody listening is not from Roanoke, can they go online and order from the website?
We don't have it set up that way currently, but we are more than willing to, if somebody emailed or called us, to try to coordinate those kind of options on a kind of a per customer basis right now. Okay,
cool. So Maureen, where can we get more about LEAP and find you guys?
So LEAP's website is LEAP for local food, LEAP, and then for local food, all spelled out, .org. And we have lots of information about the farmers, about our markets, about local food in general. We have a blog on our website, and then Facebook pages for the Grandin Village Community Market, the West End Community Market. LEAP also has a page, and so really I try and use those as information sharing tools of really like what's going on in the community, what's going on in the larger conversation of food, sharing resources. And then we're also on Twitter, LEAP for the number 4 local food. And then we are working out of the collab in Grandin Village, so that's where our office is, and then we're around town.
Well, and I know Maureen and I have talked a lot before we came on the air today about some of the new projects and initiatives that they have going on. So in some of the future episodes, we alluded to this earlier, we're going to have some other local farms on. We'll kind of continue this discussion. And we'll also talk about some of those other projects that LEAP is, getting their hands in. They've got some really cool stuff with, they have a mobile market. They're doing some things to reduce the cost for, I guess you want to call it underprivileged or lower socioeconomic families that help them get higher quality food. So a lot of really cool stuff going on there that we'll share in some future episodes. And that's it for this one. So everybody, thank you for listening. Make sure you check out the video and blog version of this one. It'll be at houseofstrengthgym.com. Like I said earlier, we'll have all the show notes with links to all those websites that everybody just threw out and any of the other resources. We'll try to get a directory link on there for a way for you to find farmers markets or local initiatives wherever you may live. And until next time, thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.